Hi, I'm Robin, and this is my channel. I decided to create this channel. I've actually been thinking about it for a while, and the purpose is to try to hold myself accountable. And what better way to do that than to foster a community, hopefully, maybe, possibly, of people who would tune in, maybe listen to what I have to say or whatever I'm talking about. So I made this specifically to track my writing. I wrote a book. It is not actually complete. I wrote it from start to finish, but it still needs to be edited, which is where the real writing happens. I think most would agree. And the idea is I will force myself to follow a routine, a discipline, a structure when it comes to editing so that I can post that in chunks. And hopefully over time, I can look back and see that I have comprised my entire editing process in a way that's consumable, digestible for myself, and maybe it will be a help for others. The manuscript I'm working on, I'm going to just call it the Dreamers Project. It is a high fantasy, multi-POV, mostly follows just a small group of characters on a very short, simple plot for the most part. It's really what I hope is complexity really comes from the characters. And I wrote this manuscript in about... it's actually very difficult to answer because I stopped and started and stopped and start. But most of it, I want to say the Act 2 onward up into the end, I wrote throughout the entirety of November and December of last year. Finished the very last words about 12 minutes before midnight on New Year's Eve. So I can say mentally in my head, I wrote a book in 2023. But now I am trying to clean it up, polish it, edit it. It's not always easy, especially when life happens. But I am currently looking at this story, and I actually enjoy editing a little bit more than I do writing. Sometimes I feel like the sense of discovery and the ease that can come with writing, just pure drafting at least, it can be really satisfying. It feels like you're just following step after step after step and you get to explore. However, there is something about editing where you can go back and it's easier to work on something that already exists. Just as we can sit down and watch a TV show or movie or read a book and we can have critical thoughts about it, being able to reapproach my work at the end just feels cathartic. It's something I enjoy doing. But like a lot of things, just because I enjoy doing it doesn't mean I'm actually that good at it, especially when it comes to staying organized. It feels like I have all these moving pieces on a board, and I'm currently trying to get them to move in a way that I actually like, and that actually satisfies me. And of course, we are our worst critics. So I managed to figure out a method that works for me. For this project, compared to anything that I've worked on in the past, I tend to work not in chronological order. I tend to write, like I'll start with the first chapter. For me, nailing that first chapter, that first scene is kind of like, it's like buying the ticket to go to the concert. You're like, I got the ticket. I saved the date. So for this project, I actually had a lot of trouble with the foundation of the story, especially in Act 1, because it contained so much exposition, so much world building. I had to do a lot of legwork with the characters because the plot, it doesn't pick up very, very fast in the beginning, but I start off like right away, jumping into my protagonist, jumping into a very specific desire that hints at an internal conflict. But otherwise, it has a lot of heavy lifting to do for the rest of the story. And it's because of Act 1 being so front-loaded, I guess you would call it, that the rest of the story is able to pop the way it does. It just flows a lot faster. It only works because I put so much work into the first act. And I think at this point, I have to edit this the complete opposite way that I wrote it. So when drafting, I wrote it from start to finish. I had to. And sort of like when you're walking down a path and there's a fork in the road, but the fork is next to you instead of in front of you, you can't see the other road through the trees and the thicket until you've already passed the fork and look backward. So for me, I have to edit in groups. I have to take every chapter, every scene, and put them into groups to figure out what matches so that I can go over the work and make everything consistent, make the changes I want to make. And that has been the toughest part. But once I told myself that I don't have to follow the same rules that I've made myself follow just to draft the story, everything became a lot easier. Not easy enough that this is a breeze, but easier. And I like looking back at it knowing that I can jump here and there working on what I want to work with. So the best place to start for me is actually the protagonist. This is something I want to revisit twice. I decided that I wanted to go over the story in multiple passes, and with each pass, I wanted to look for something specific and then come back to it again and come back to it again. And the first level of passes is focused entirely on character. So I want to go through the story. I want to look at each character individually, like what they're saying in dialogue, their arcs. Does everything they say and do in a scene make sense to who they are as a character? And have I nailed what I intended to do with those characters? For some of them, first draft, I nailed it out of the park, I believe, on the first draft. Some of them, not. One character in particular, I had no plans for her to even be present throughout most of the story, so I have to go back and work on a lot. And it's interesting because I think that she's a character that I put the most thought into after I was writing that first draft. But for the protagonist, I need to go back into the story. I need to examine every single scene, specifically where I talk about his specific desire, his specific fears, which you would think would pop in every scene, but it doesn't. It's only in very specific scenes that it kind of bubbles up to the surface, because I didn't want the character to be too melodramatic. I didn't want him to come off as too brooding. So the best way to work with this character really was to go back and just examine those few moments where either internally or externally in dialogue, he is approaching his specific conflict, which has to do with his state of mind, what he wants to be in the future, ideal version of himself that he wants to make true, even if that version of himself in the beginning is not entirely true and authentic to what he thinks will make him happy. But, that's what makes a good story. And what he wants to do aligns with what a bunch of other characters who end up getting involved in the story, in their journey, what they want to accomplish. And so that's what causes these parties to cross together, and they form a group of characters that go on this journey. For this character, for the most part, he has really about 6 or 7 scenes where I touch upon this specific driving force and motivation for him. I didn't want it to be something that was too heavy-handed throughout most of the story and the narrative. So it really comes down to several scenes. And since I'm working on this in chunks and I'm working on it backward, I actually started with the most pivotal scene where this character, this protagonist, is making a very significant, important choice that puts him at great risk, that is antithetical to what he even came here to do. Instead, he's just 180 reverse, we're doing something different. So with this character, I have a scene where he is confronted with someone very old, very wise, very powerful, who basically tells him, I have the answer to all your problems. The problem is that the answer is not something that the protagonist really wants to hear. And he can't put into words just yet why this is something he doesn't want to hear, why this is something that chafes against his very nature, because he spends so much of the story, he's a character who's very introspective and intuitive, which can be really hard to write, because then sometimes in their internal thoughts and monologues, they can come off as editorial, as if you can see the writer behind them. But this character is very introspective and insightful, and I wanted to write this character as someone who is intensely aware of how he's feeling and hypersensitive, but at the same time, he doesn't truly understand his own nature, and this story is part of it is a self-discovery of his own nature, and also confronting the reality that he lives in a world where you can't safely explore your own nature. There's no hour or day promised to you for you to be able to do this and go on this journey, but that's life. True in fiction, true in reality. So for this character, I do have this important scene where it is supposed to be the actual emotional climax of the character. Despite the fact that it comes before the end of Act 2, it is the climax of his own self-actualization and realizing who he is, who he can be, and what he wants. And it's a little strange because the story goes on after, but it's only because that's one part of what he wants to accomplish. And the choice he makes does put him in a position of greater vulnerability, of greater threat and danger, as the actual problem that sent him on this mission, this quest to begin with, has not been resolved. So now he has to live with his choice as the rest of the story continues. And I think I like doing that a lot more than past manuscripts, past stories I wrote, where my protagonist usually comes to certain conclusions and ideas during the physical external climax of the story. It's kind of nice to write one where the protagonist kind of figures things out a little bit ahead of time, but that realization does not bring him actual comfort. He sits more comfortably in his own skin, but he doesn't feel any less shaky with the world, with the conflict that brought him here in the first place. So I broke this down into several scenes, and I have this concept I came up with. I'm calling them scene cousins. So the idea is that every scene, all the scenes in the story, they make up like a family. But some scenes are sisters, some scenes are a fourth cousin twice removed. I've never known what that means, nor do I want to. And some scenes are sort of like cousins in the sense that they're not next to each other on the family tree, but they're close because they grew up together and they only had one controller and they played the N64 and et cetera, you get where I'm going. So I broke down this character, his character arc, his self-actualization into several scenes throughout the story that are all related to each other. And the idea is that I'm editing those scenes one after another. That way, the syntax is consistent, my imagery is consistent, and there is a natural, organic change throughout this character in each of these scenes. Starting with, of course, this climactic scene where my protagonist makes this really major decision, despite the stakes, despite what he could lose and what could happen to him, and despite the fact that he is standing in front of a living example of what will happen to him if this goes wrong. Which, genius idea. Am I hyping myself up too much? Of course, after the scene, I do need to reapproach a scene near the actual finale of the story, where I kind of just hone in and hammer in that last idea of self-actualization of the main character because he's confronted with the major antagonist. There's a scene shortly before this scene where the character first approaches the idea of who he wants to be in an argument with an ally. I have to go back to that scene because I have a feeling that I have a feeling that I was too on the nose and I was too on target with the way the character was feeling. Like, it should have taken him a little bit longer to realize what he wants. But the best place to start is this actual moment. So I can write it out, have the right prose that I want to really sell what the main character is feeling, and that way I can go backward in the story and write up to that. So, wish me luck. Okay, I think if I were to make a side-by-side comparison, I like the way this has turned out. Originally, this scene had my protagonist, he finally arrives at a place after a lot of different obstacles. It's almost like a reverse heist. Instead of breaking in to retrieve something, it's breaking in to be retrieved. I kind of like that. Originally, the character, he comes face to face with this ancient old being, and he wants a solution to his problems. He wants the fix, the remedy. And the two have a good conversation, but it was very exposition heavy. I snuck in a lot of things that at the time that I was drafting the story, I was coming up with them, not really on the spot, but it was things then in the back of my head that I knew were really important to the story. I was figuring it out as I wrote. And so I think I used that scene originally to write all of that out. And honestly, it's kind of helpful to actually write plainly in my draft. So now that I'm coming back to edit it, I have my own notes within what the characters are saying and how they're feeling to tell me what I want to change. So originally they have this conversation, a lot of exposition, and then the conversation is interrupted by another threat. And this time around, the point of the edit was to ramp up the stakes of that chapter. I do feel like the conversation almost went a little too easy. These are two different people from two different generations, from two different worlds. The older entity, even though he's not really ancient, he's 600 years old, he comes from a completely different world. He has different values, different priorities, and he knows things the protagonist doesn't. So a huge part of this scene should be sort of a clash of their experiences, their ideas, and even though one character is offering help for the other and the other character wants help, they interpret what that help means very differently. So this time I ramped up the stakes, and then I had this conversation between them build up as they realize just how similar they are, but the older person is bringing a warning, and it culminates with actual physical conflict. So that conflict was not meant to be anything crazy because the stakes are already high due to other measures, and I didn't want to create too much of a spectacle. I think if you have too many conflicts that are almost equal in stakes, equal in suspense and tension and energy, then one can cheapen the other. So instead, I let that be almost a physical outlet for the clash of these two characters, their ideas, and how my protagonist responds to it. And the fact that he's able to hold his own is supposed to be representative of his resolve, especially because to himself, to anyone watching, really only one other person, it seems as if he came to his conclusion almost suddenly, but it all makes sense when you take into account the slow rise he's been taking toward coming to this conclusion, which includes a scene that I actually have to go revisit after working on this one. So that is the next one I need to approach. That one I'm a little iffy on. I left notes for myself when I did my first read-through that I need to go back. I need to write that scene with a lot more hesitance when it comes to these two characters, because he shouldn't be so positive, so certain about his ideas just yet. That should be something that's kind of cooking, simmering in the background. And then in this climactic scene that I just edited, that's when he says, here it is on silver platter. You know, it gets shoved back in his face, but it works. So that would be the next rush. I probably will take a break, eat something, and I don't know, maybe in the morning if I'm free, I'll probably go to the coffee shop and get a little writing done. Something about being in a public place both makes me self-conscious about what I'm doing, but also makes me want to not waste as much time, because I think a part of me really wants to leave and go home. Yeah, that's one out of hopefully at maximum 7 of these scenes that I need to edit. And hopefully once I'm done with this, that's the main chunk, I believe. That's your protagonist and your protagonist's internal conflict. That's the actual meat and soul of the story. So once I'm done editing these 7 scenes, that is like a benchmark. And from there, it's just smooth sailing. Hopefully, fingers crossed, knock on wood.
Several days later.
So ignore the sound of Final Fantasy XIV in the background. It is my current source of procrastination because the new expansion just dropped. And also, I'm keeping this above chest level because there's a giant Yoo-hoo stain on the front of my shirt, so I'm going to change. But the agenda today is I'm going to a coffee shop nearby, hoping it's kind of cloudy, hope it doesn't rain. And I am trying to focus on, I think in the previous vlog, I talked about a particular scene where a protagonist is supposed to actualize and come to a decision that affects everything about his psyche, his personhood, his future, his safety. And I'm going back to work on a scene that happens 6 chapters before, where that topic is first broached by an ally who could become a friend or could go in the wrong direction. And I want to reapproach that scene now from the idea of, okay, coming up in 6 chapters, we're going to challenge that. So I have to go back, look at the scene through the lens of, okay, well, what kind of person is he now? What is he going through now? What is in his head? And how can we kind of write these emotions to kind of catch fire so that when we get to the scene in 6 chapters, everything's ablaze. So, and honestly, I need some coffee. So... So this was an interesting session. I reread the scene I wanted to work on, and lo and behold, I could not see what exactly was wrong with it according to my notes. The tension is there, the hesitation of my protagonist is evident, so I couldn't see where exactly I could wrangle in greater internal conflict. The one place I did fit something in was a paragraph that was a bit clunky, so I broke it up for more call and answer style dialogue that dove into that conflict a bit better. I honestly cannot wait to do line edits and give some more flavor to scenes like this, make my metaphors more consistent, hopefully, which kind of creates like a larger subconscious picture. But you can see I'm kind of twiddling my thumbs while looking over the scene again, because I felt like, what can I actually do with this? But I finally made that edit and I moved on to the next scene. Also, I kept looking over my laptop because someone came in with the cutest dog and she would just let me look over and just smile at me. And I'm like, oh, come on. Like, I wanted to pet the dog, but then like, you never know when it comes to like someone else's dog, so I didn't want to bother anybody. But anyway, the next scene I had to work on was my protagonist coming face to face with a threat that's loomed over most of the story, which is actually the major antagonist. And at that point had only made an appearance very early on. This was a bit more tough. Like the previous scene in chapter 30, the dialogue and pacing was actually really tight, leaving a little breathing room to hit home that point again. I discovered a lot of little details I'd like to revive in future passes when I handle other issues like the world building, some of the magic, and I might go back and change like one character, but for the most part, my protagonist's internal conflict isn't really challenged here specifically. Instead, something is revealed about him that makes him re-examine his own character, and I sort of let that sit into the actual finale. Still, like with the previous scene, I found one area where I actually think not enough was said between those two characters, and the scene goes by rather quickly. I took one character's monologue, I broke it into two, and let the protagonist and this character have more of a back and forth, so we get a clash of their ideas. It actually feels way more organic now, even though it was like a really small change. But otherwise, this scene is solid until I come back to it to make those other little detail changes. Anyway, I drank too much coffee and my leg wouldn't stop shaking, so I had this crazy urge to go home and nap. And that's a wrap for now. Okay, I am joining a live stream. Don't know if any of you know of her, but I will link to her channel in the description. It's Lynn and I'm just gonna join. She's doing like a writing session, write with me type of live stream. And I just realized I pronounced her last name the German way. Maybe that's correct. I don't know. But joining, it's kind of nice to just be in something of a space where other people are creating, especially if they're writing. Even though I'm technically not writing, I'm editing, but that's part of writing. I do know that at the time, a lot of people are participating or preparing for Camp NaNoWriMo. So it is nice to have like in the background, some people did, even in the comments, like in the live, to have a soundboard. So, in we go.
Lynn's trips are my Super Bowl. It's not nearly as high budget, but they...
Okay, I just spent longer than I thought I would on this scene. The live stream was actually really great to have that in the background, and the conversations actually were really fun. For the most part, I rewrote this entire interaction, mini scene conversation between these two characters. So just to go back to like the previous video where I wrote like a penultimate scene to the entire story, confrontation between my protagonist and the major antagonist, their conflict of ideas, and I didn't have a lot to contribute and add in this particular pass, only because I wanted to focus only on my protagonist's internal conflict. And I felt like at the point where he finally encounters this person was not the time to again challenge or rethink what his inner conflict is. Instead, I wanted to focus on just him learning more about himself. I want there to be depth beyond this one conflict that he has, especially if I don't plan for this book to be the end of his story or the other characters. So the depth comes in how much more is there beyond what we know, what is the conflict now. Since I moved on from that pretty quickly, I was able to jump even farther backwards. So just to keep a timeline, I started this edit with a scene at the end of Act 2 where my character, he basically makes a really big decision that is based off of his idea of who he wants to be, what he wants to be, regardless of the dangers around him. It's kind of like trying to grow a field of flowers in the middle of like no man's land, like a battlefield. So then I went from there to 6 chapters back where he has a sort of disagreement, argument with an ally that includes some idea of like, well, what are you trying to do? What's the purpose of risking anything? And my protagonist has the idea in his head of like perhaps who he wants to be. So I went backward so I could write him being a little less certain, less sure. The idea is that like he's bouncing around an idea in his head of perhaps what he wants to be. And I didn't have much to change there either. It really feels like the first time I wrote this, these particular scenes were written a lot tighter Like, I tend to be a leaner writer, especially when it comes to first drafts. Like, there's not a lot of fluff. So then when it comes to second passes and revisions, then I find, oh, I kind of need some fluff. Like, it's almost all meat and veggies. There needs to be some healthy fats in there. Yeah, I was able to break up some of that too, to try to include a little bit more nuance and back and forth. Then I jumped from that to, in the future, almost near the end of the book, with the confrontation between my protagonist and the major antagonist. And I jumped backward again to the very second chapter of the story. But I'm looking at this chapter, and part of this chapter, or most of it, really is a conflict, an argument between him and his best friend, really. And they have a disagreement that is based on their cultural and emotional values. And they're an interesting pair to write. I have a lot more work to do with them as friends to write throughout the rest of the story. But a lot of that is tied into the list of edits I have for her. So I mentioned writing scene cousins. I have a separate list of scene cousins just for that character. And a lot of those scenes involve my protagonist. So in those scenes I need to work on, for the most part, my protagonist is kind of, he's set. I don't really need to make too many changes to how he's presented within the story, within the narrative with that other character. It's her that I have to work on. Because out of everything with this story, when I originally came up with the idea, when I originally drafted part of it, she was never supposed to be part of this journey. She was supposed to tap out at a certain point in the story and then pop back in with the rest of these other characters who tap out. But something in my head went, nope, do something different. And completely unplanned, I changed it so that she becomes part of the journey. And now that I've done it, I can't imagine having done it any other way. There's just something about having a trio of characters to have different but complementary personalities to bounce off of each other. It definitely provides a lot more variety when it comes to the exposition, when it comes to their dynamics and handling conflict and how they move forward. So she's the character who honestly had the least amount of thought that went into her outside of her being the friend of the main character. And now she is a main character. And I have so much I want to do with her character that a lot of these scenes where my protagonist is set, I still have to go back and look at her and how she reacts to things, how she communicates, especially since I wanted to present her with a very specific type of personality. I think the way I wrote her in this draft, which is like really her first time existing as a character, not just a background plot element. I don't know how to explain it. She has a certain reserved, proper, but dryness to her. Like that kind of person who you don't realize it because of their tone. It's very like monotone, low energy. You don't realize that they're like maybe actually a really nice person or really kind and thoughtful and really helpful because they don't stand out. They don't naturally attract attention. And I wanted to write a character like that, especially in comparison to my protagonist, because there's a depth to him that he's a little bit more reserved and he presents himself as very polite, but there's an energy about him. And it's more apparent in other characters and their POVs versus his. But I wanted to write her as that character who, she's the person who is easily overshadowed and overlooked. And I think I did a good job writing that this first time around, but I definitely want to make changes to her to make it just sharper, give it a little bit more punch, to give her depth, especially because I came up with her backstory on the spot as I wrote her. This argument scene between her and the protagonist, really tough to write. Every single time I approached it, I think this is, I've written it 3 times. There was one time I wrote it, completely changed it the second time, edited and changed it the third time. And that was when I finally finished Act 1 before, finishing the entire story for NaNoWriMo. And here it is the 4th time I'm approaching it. And it is honestly so much better. There was so much melodrama. I think the first 2 times around, there was a pass I did where I tried to straighten up the lore and the world building. And I did not like, I don't like how heavy-handed it felt. Like, I think oftentimes one of the most powerful things about the written medium is you don't have to, you can tell and not show sometimes. I know this sounds controversial because it's always show, don't tell, show, don't tell. Every writing tool has a time and a place. I think that you should prefer to show, not tell, because you want to guide the reader, or yourself, you're just writing for yourself. You want to guide the reader through a journey. There's only so much space in the psychic mindscape that's like the stage, you know, like all the world's a stage and the stage is in here. And there's only so much room to fit all these characters and the world and what they're saying to each other. So sometimes you have to show the things that are the most important, and the less important something is, you have to tell. I think there's an emphasis on fantasy and sci-fi when this happens, when it comes to like exposition. But exposition is an element of like every type of story in every genre. It could be a contemporary modern day drama about, I don't know, a young woman who lost her mother to cancer. Sorry, got dark on you. And that happened 4 years ago, and I hear she is redoing her life, whatever. The point is that that is part of her backstory, and people talk about backstory often. I use that word a lot, but backstory is exposition. And sometimes when it comes to backstory, sometimes you have to tell and not show, to weave it in more carefully into the narrative, into the prose, in a way that feels clean, that also keeps us psychically grounded in that current setting, that moment. We're just getting a greater understanding of like a character and what they're feeling or thinking, or they're remembering something, without pulling us away from it, changing the tenses, and then creating like a new scene technically. But I bring that up because this scene, this argument between these characters, it was clunky before. There was a lot of little lore drops in there, and it's so much better that I'm having these two characters arguing, but we're only getting one character's POV, and his reflection on what she's saying to him is making him remember things and think about things, like things that he's all thinking about to offer as a rebuttal to what she's saying, but he's not saying everything that he thinks. He's being selective about what he's saying. And that is so important to be able to weave in the show versus the tell. Like the show would be if I broke into a flashback to give actual like real-time context of what he's thinking about, what he's remembering. But the tell is the little sprinkle, you know, a little bit of seasoning on there. And that was really important. It cleaned up this whole interaction a lot, which left more room for them to just have it out. And this time, I'm so glad I went over this. This time, I went through it and I just kind of took like a little bit of those baking sheets like that you use to bake cookies on. I should know this term, but I took some of that and I just kind of rubbed it over the rusty iron rails. I don't know if you've ever seen like skaters somewhere just skating, whatever. Sometimes they'll use those, or they use like can of spray and oil up rails so that they can skate and glide over them easier. But I went over it and I sanded off, well, there's the metaphor. I sanded off the edges of this interaction, because even though they're upset with each other and they're having an argument, they're still friends. And sometimes we don't pull our punches with our friends, but the whole point of trusting someone and caring for someone and being friends is that you actively choose to fight fair. And I had to change this, rewrite it, hit some of the points better, because I feel like they both are right because they feel so strongly about how they feel. They're just right about different things. It really is just a clash of ideas and them misunderstanding each other. And it softens it, which makes it less dramatic and like 180 when they resolve things and pick up their friendship where they left off later. So I really think the next big thing I need to tackle is either going to be the protagonist's best friend, because there's a lot I want to work in there. There's this whole, I'm about to get very cerebral and pretentious with this character, so I might have to trim it down in another pass. But I have this whole symbolism idea with her and white rabbits. I don't know why I was like, oh, white rabbits, genius. And then present that as like something that's like fragile, easily scared. You know, you frighten it and it dies. Her self-perception as something that is fragile, something that is unworthy of attention and adoration, and the idea that she treats other people with such grace and kindness, and this journey is to put her in front of a mirror. And I might actually have a character actually say it to her, like, could you be as kind to yourself as you are to other people? But of course I have to write in a way where it goes over her head, where it's like for her that does not compute. And this journey is to put her in front of a mirror, and I might actually have a character actually say it to her, like, could you be as kind to yourself as you are to other people? But of course, I have to write in a way where it goes over her head, where it's like, for her, that does not compute until we get to the climax and the end of her arc, where she is able to view herself as she views others with the same patience and kindness that, you know, she offers in the moment where she needs it most to dodge death itself. Wait a second. No, I was gonna say, is her arc better than a protagonist? But sometimes an arc really works only when it's in the peripheral. Like if she was the protagonist, if the story followed her and her journey, and I stretched out these moments with her and really expounded the way that I'm doing with my actual protagonist, it wouldn't have the same weight. It's the difference between having a slice of pie and eating the whole pie. Yeah, I'm probably gonna jump into either her next, or I might address that other character I mentioned, the one that's like an ancient being, a demigod that was helping my protagonist in the chapter where he has the big self-actualization moment. That character actually has his own arc throughout the story. It's very small. I might work on that first. It really depends on, it's a toss-up. Who knows who I'll be in a few days with work and life, but I'll roll the die, and whichever one calls to me the most, I think probably I'm gonna work on the demigod guy, only because his scenes are already technically written. I just want to rewrite them. Especially that last one. But yeah, we'll see. But thank you for joining me on this unhinged, poorly edited, poorly filmed on an iPhone journey. And tune in next time.